This is not a Macintosh, but we're not about to let something that trivial stop us. I'm Matt D'Amico, and welcome to episode 30 of Retro Bits. Welcome to Marcintosh, a month-long celebration of all things classic Mac. Now, to be honest, I've never owned a pre-OS X Mac. I grew up with Apple IIs and Commodores, and went straight into a 386 at the end of the 8-bit era, so I never truly got to experience what the Mac had to offer. Marcintosh seems like the perfect opportunity to rectify that, but all I've got is this Amiga. Not a problem, because classic Macs share the same Motorola 68000 based architecture, and there are several different software and hardware solutions available to run macOS on the Amiga. The one we'll be looking at today is called ShapeShifter. ShapeShifter is a software-only emulator that allows the Amiga to run both macOS and Amiga OS simultaneously. It has an impressive list of features that we'll be looking more closely at, and offers speeds comparable to a real Mac with equivalent hardware. ShapeShifter will run on any 68020 or better Amiga with OS 2.1 and at least 4 MB of RAM. In addition, you'll need a Macintosh ROM and a copy of classic macOS, which is freely available on Apple's website. ShapeShifter hasn't been updated since 2001, and even states that the project has been replaced by a newer product called Basilisk 2. In testing, I found that Basilisk is well supported on modern platforms, but the Amiga version is not as fully developed and lacks the features, stability, documentation, and ease of use that ShapeShifter provides, so I'll be sticking with what works best for me in this video. To get this train rolling, we're going to need a few things, starting with the ShapeShifter software itself. We'll also need a 512K or 1 MB ROM from any 68K Mac. I've chosen the 2CI due to its similar specifications to the Amiga 3000 being used in this experiment. Next, we'll need a boot floppy, as well as the OS 753 install media, both in DSK format, which can be mounted directly in ShapeShifter. Last, we'll need some software to run on macOS, so I grabbed Stuffit Expander and a variety of tools and games. I've already gone ahead and copied these files to my Amiga's SCSI to SD drive, and everything else will be done live on real hardware. It's also possible to do this experiment using a much faster Amiga emulator on a modern system, but I wanted to share the full, authentic experience with you, albeit with a few strategic fast-forwards in the interest of saving time. Now, if you're like me and have minimal experience with classic Macs, you may look at Apple's product lineup around the early 90s and wonder what the heck was going on. Trust me, you're not alone. Without being able to draw on experience, I selected the 2CI from this haystack because it compares nicely with the Amiga 3000. The 2CI was released in late 1989, while the 3000 came out in mid-1990. They both sport the Motorola 68030 processor running at 25 MHz, and both have a floating point unit. Something to note, though, was that the Mac was initially priced at nearly double the cost of the Amiga. Before starting the install, I'm going to activate the multi-scan monitor profile from storage. I'll be using this profile to run ShapeShifter at 640 by 480 on an LCD instead of the usual 1084S CRT, so as to avoid having to deal with interlaced video modes. All the files I prepared earlier on the PC have been copied into my data partition on the Amiga. I'll be able to install the OS and all of the software from here, although it is possible to use real floppy disks or CD media if desired. Installing ShapeShifter itself is as simple as extracting the archive file. In this case, I'll put it on my apps partition, but it can be run from anywhere. Okay, let's take a quick look at ShapeShifter's super comprehensive and helpful manual. In it, you'll find detailed installation and configuration guidance, as well as performance tuning information, key mappings, and much more. macOS requires the use of the lower 8K of chip RAM, so it must be kept free. In the past, this was accomplished by installing a program called Prepare Emul in your startup sequence. As of Amiga OS 3.1.4, this step is no longer required as the update keeps the first 16K of memory free. Since we're going to be using this icon a lot, I'll leave it out on the desktop for easy access. Next, we'll need to copy the 512K ROM from the Mac 2CI into the ShapeShifter folder. It must also be renamed to ShapeShifter ROM with a space for it to work. If you have a classic Mac, a program called Save ROM is included in the archive that will extract your ROM to a file for use with the Amiga. That done, we'll need a place to install macOS to. ShapeShifter supports both hard files as well as real physical disks and partitions. There is a performance penalty for using a hard file, so I'm going to create a real partition on my SCSI2SD for the Mac. Most of the 8GB SD card hasn't been allocated, so I'll provision a relatively small partition for the emulator. There's a good reason not to go overboard with the size, and you'll see why in a minute. This step is entirely optional, but it's a convenience. Here, I'm going to format and mount up the new partition as an Amiga volume, but only temporarily. ShapeShifter can read the drive parameters from existing volumes, so there's no guesswork involved in specifying the disk geometry. Now we're ready to start ShapeShifter for the first time and set up our disk. ShapeShifter supports simultaneously mounting 2 disk images along with 2 physical disk partitions. It even allows you to create empty disk image files directly from the menu. By selecting our newly formatted macOS partition, all of the disk parameters are read in for us, which saves us making any mistakes or risking corrupting our existing partitions or data. Back in HD Toolbox, I've disabled auto-mounting of the macOS partition. In a minute, it'll no longer be readable by the Amiga anyway. Nearly there now. I'm going to allocate 8 megabytes to the emulator, as that much is required for certain software we'll be using. There are options in this menu that trade off performance for maximum available memory, but I'm setting things up for speed to start off with. Now to add our boot and install media images and start up our emulated Mac for the first time. I've opted to use disk images for convenience, but it is possible to use the built-in Amiga floppy drive to read Mac disks. However, a high-density drive would be better, such as the one in the A4000. Also of note is that while the emulator can mount 2 virtual disk drives, one thing that's missing that's common in modern emulators is the ability to mount and unmount images on the fly while the emulator is running. No such luck here. And here we go! Our virtual Mac is alive and booting from the floppy disk image. Pretty darn quickly, too. It immediately detects that our hard disk partition isn't Mac formatted and gives us the opportunity to initialize it. And now we get to see why I didn't make a large Mac OS disk. The 250 megabyte partition I did create took about 20 minutes to initialize. While Macintosh code executes natively and at full speed on the Amiga's Motorola CPU, disk access is still emulated, and as such, suffers a bit of a performance hit. We'll take a look at some benchmarks later, but for now I'm going to skip forward. With the disk initialized, we can now see our physical hard drive partition as well as the 2 disk images we mounted up. The next step is to unpack the install media and install macOS. Let me apologize for the video recording here. It looks choppy, but that was my capture card acting up all of a sudden, not the emulator running poorly. I'll switch to live video here till I get the capture card sorted. With the installation media unpacked, I'm just going to run the setup program and use the easy install option. I've never installed classic macOS prior to this, but I found the process to be straightforward and intuitive. Select your target disk and click the button. That's all there is to it. And with that, we have a successful macOS 7.5.3 install on the Amiga 3000. Time to hit the restart button and cross our fingers. Already we're starting to get a look at how this emulator performs. The UI is snappy and responsive, and everything seems to be working as it should. I'm going to disable the default background pattern because it doesn't scale well on my LCD or with the capture device. I'll also disable some unneeded extensions to free up some memory and speed up booting as we're going to be restarting a whole bunch. Now it's time to install some software, and the first thing we'll need is Stuffit Expander, which will be used to decompress all the other programs I copied over. I've downloaded a DSK image of the software so I can mount it right up in ShapeShifter and install it to the macOS hard drive. Now we're ready to install some software in earnest, but how do we get it from the Amiga to the Mac? ShapeShifter delivers once again with a Mac to Amiga disk bridge called Mac Handler. To use it, a few files need to be installed on the Amiga per the manual's guidance. With that done, start up the Mac. Then hit Ctrl-Tab to switch the mouse focus and Amiga M to toggle back and forth between desktops. Run the Mac Handler software and the macOS partition will be mounted on the Amiga's desktop. From there, just drag and drop any software or files you want to install. It's worth noting that the Mac Handler can mount both the Mac's data and resource forks, but only one at a time. This isn't a problem when copying over compressed files, but there's an extra step involved if you want to preserve the resource fork. I installed a program called ResEdit on the Mac to restore missing data types when needed. With this compressed file copied from the Amiga, switch back to the Mac and it's already there waiting on the desktop. Just drag it onto the Stuff It Expander icon to decompress the archive. You can switch back to the Amiga desktop while this task is running, and it'll keep going in the background. 2 fully functional multitasking operating systems at the same time, on original unaccelerated hardware from 1990. How cool is that? In addition to Stuff It Expander, I'm also installing a program called Disk Copy. This software allows you to mount disk images directly inside of macOS, which makes copying data from floppy images to the hard disk a breeze. Using Disk Copy, I can now mount up this IMG file and copy it or run it directly. With all the major setup steps now handled, we're ready to put this virtual Mac 2CI through its paces. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the emulator's graphics performance. You'll have noticed that up till now, I've been running the Mac in black and white 1-bit color, and there's a good reason for this. ShapeShifter supports 16 color mode on this ECS Amiga, 256 colors on an AGA machine, and up to 16.8 million colors when using a retargetable graphics card. It can even support dual monitors. The Amiga implements its graphics by storing pixel color in multiple layers called bitplanes. Macs and PCs use a different method known as chunky graphics, where the data is organized in consecutive clusters. While there are advantages and trade-offs for each method, the important thing is that ShapeShifter has to convert from chunky to bitplane when using the Amiga's built-in graphics. The greater the color depth, the more processor-intensive the conversion is. With this being an unaccelerated machine, running with color enabled really takes its toll on the performance, as I've demonstrated here. With an accelerated AGA system, 256 color graphics modes are no issue, and with an RTG card, the sky's the limit, as these cards implement chunky graphics natively. I've even heard of people with these setups running Warcraft 2 and Duke Nukem 3D just fine in ShapeShifter. For MMU-equipped machines, there's also a custom video driver for ShapeShifter that can accelerate color graphics modes, but on my machine it didn't seem to make any appreciable difference. Now, let's benchmark this emulated Mac using an application called Speedometer. This program will run through a variety of processor, graphic, memory, and disk tests, then let us compare our virtual Mac to a variety of real models. As mentioned earlier, the Macintosh code runs natively on the Amiga's CPU, but other things like disk and graphics are emulated to some degree, so we should temper our expectations accordingly. Okay, the results are in. I know this isn't exactly fair, but let's compare our virtual system to the original Mac Classic from the same year as this Amiga. No real surprises here, our 030 based system shreds the 8 MHz 68K Classic. The real comparison is against the 2CI, so let's take a look at that. Going down the list of benchmarks for the first time, I was pretty much speechless. Here is a machine that costs half as much, using only software to emulate a comparable system, and keeping up. Heck, not just keeping up, but actually beating the original hardware in a handful of tests. Okay, the graphics and disk performance suffer, but that was expected. All this while still maintaining full access to the underlying multitasking Amiga OS. Okay, time to test out some fun software, starting with this mod player to test ShapeShifter's sound capabilities. No problems here, the Amiga perfectly emulates a Mac playing an Amiga music file. In testing, I found that many game titles worked fine, especially those that didn't require color or changing the desktop resolution. These types of titles ran at completely playable speeds with no appreciable input lag or slowdowns. Sound emulation was also crisp and properly synchronized with gameplay. On the other hand, some games were partially playable but would lock up at certain points, such as Dark Castle. Other games, such as Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, would crash the machine instantly. At this point, I'm not sure if it's a problem with the graphics or memory settings, but I've tried every permutation of options available to me, as well as different Macintosh ROMs and OS versions to no avail. I think we've covered the basics of ShapeShifter, but there are a few more advanced features we haven't talked about. First, the Amiga floppy drives can be used by the emulated Mac. In addition, attached SCSI devices can be passed through to the Mac, such as scanners, printers, and CD-ROMs. Serial and parallel from the host machines can also be shared, as can the network interfaces. ShapeShifter even supports sharing a clipboard between the Mac and Amiga. In this demonstration, I've connected my Y-Modem 232 to the Amiga and started up ZTerm on the Mac. Without changing a single setting from the defaults, I was able to connect to the Captain's Quarters 2, a Macintosh BBS, and spread the word about Marcintosh. The Amiga offers impressive gaming and media capabilities with its sound, video, and multitasking. The classic Macintosh has a clean, professional, and intuitive user interface with a huge library of productivity software. Running them simultaneously on a single machine gives you the best of both worlds. Despite a few problems that still need to be ironed out, I think we can call today's experiment a resounding success. I would like to come back and revisit ShapeShifter with a proper RTG card in the future, so stay tuned. Normally, you'd use a newer, more powerful machine to emulate a lesser system, but not in this case. With ShapeShifter on the Amiga, it's possible to not only emulate a contemporary system with similar specs, but do it competently and at zero cost. Really impressive stuff. I've had a lot of fun playing around with and getting to know classic macOS for the very first time. If you're looking for more, I'll be dropping links to other Marcintosh content in the description below. I hope you learned something new. I know I did. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Retro Bits.